There were 400 people in that studio, but when that voice echoed through the speakers, not a single soul could breathe. The cameras were rolling. The lights were warm, golden, casting their familiar glow across the iconic curved couch where thousands of guests had sat before. Oprah Winfrey leaned forward in her chair, her hands folded, her eyes locked on the man sitting across from her. Everything was perfect. Everything was going exactly as planned, until it wasn't. The man's name was Daniel Morrison, 52 years old, a firefighter for 3 decades, a hero who had saved hundreds of lives throughout his career. But there was one life he couldn't save. 4 lives, actually. His wife, his 2 sons, his 5-year-old daughter, Emma. 20 years ago, on a cold December night, Daniel's house caught fire while he was on duty at the station 3 miles away. By the time he arrived, racing through red lights with tears blurring his vision, there was nothing left but smoke and ashes and silence. The flames had taken everything: his family, his photographs, his future, everything except the guilt that would haunt him for the next 2 decades. He hadn't cried since that night. Not once. Not at the funeral, where 4 coffins stood side by side beneath a gray winter sky. Not on the anniversaries, when the world seemed to stop spinning around him. Not when he visited their graves every Sunday morning with 4 cups of coffee and a stuffed elephant that had belonged to Emma, the only thing that survived because it had been in his locker at the station that terrible night. But what happened in the next 3 minutes would shatter 20 years of silence. And it all started with a cassette tape that everyone thought had been destroyed in the flames. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Oprah had known about Daniel long before the interview was scheduled. His story had circulated through her production team for months, passed from researcher to researcher, each one saying the same thing. This one is different. This one will change people. She had read his file 3 times. She had watched the news footage from that December night in 2004. She had seen the photographs of Daniel standing in front of the smoldering ruins of his home, his firefighter uniform covered in ash, his face completely blank. Empty. The local news reporter had tried to interview him that night. Daniel had just stared at the camera without speaking. Then he walked back toward the ruins and started digging through the debris with his bare hands. But what drew Oprah to Daniel wasn't the tragedy itself. It was what he did in the years after the flames consumed his entire world. Instead of falling apart, Daniel Morrison became the most decorated firefighter in his department's history. He ran into burning buildings when others hesitated. He carried children out of smoke-filled rooms. He held the hands of dying victims and whispered that everything would be okay, even when it wouldn't be. His colleagues called him fearless. His supervisors called him dedicated. The mayor gave him medals. But Oprah suspected something else. She had spent 40 years studying human nature, learning to see beneath the surface of people's carefully constructed armor, and she suspected that Daniel Morrison wasn't running toward danger. He was running away from memory. The interview had been emotional from the first question. Daniel spoke about his wife, Sarah, with a tenderness that made the audience reach for their tissues. He described how they met at a county fair when they were 17, how she had beaten him at the ring toss game and refused to give him her number until he won her a stuffed bear. "It took me 14 tries, Daniel said, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. Cost me $40, but she was worth every penny, every single penny." He described his sons, Michael and James, as 2 tornadoes wrapped in mud and mischief. Michael wanted to be an astronaut, James wanted to be a chef, and when he mentioned Emma, his voice changed. It became softer, almost reverent, like he was speaking about something sacred and untouchable. "She was the one who made everything make sense," Daniel said, his calloused hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. "When I came home from a hard shift, when I'd seen things no person should ever see, She would climb into my lap and just stay there. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't ask questions. She just knew that Daddy needed her. And that was enough. It was always enough. Oprah nodded slowly. She could feel the weight of 20 years pressing down on this man's shoulders like an invisible mountain that never stopped growing heavier. "Daniel," Oprah said gently, her voice barely above a whisper, "in 20 years, you've never spoken publicly about that night. You've never given interviews. Why now?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. The studio held its breath. 400 people leaning forward in their seats, waiting. "Because I'm tired," he finally said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I'm tired of pretending I'm okay when I wake up every morning, reaching for a woman who isn't there. I'm tired of being the strong one when there's nothing strong left inside me. I'm tired of smiling at awards ceremonies when all I want to do is scream." He paused. His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. They never fell. 20 years and they never fell. "And I'm tired of forgetting what her voice sounded like." The words hung in the air like smoke. Oprah felt something shift in her chest. In 40 years of interviews, she had sat across from presidents and criminals, survivors and dreamers, the famous and the forgotten. She had heard stories of unimaginable loss before. She had lived through her own, the child she lost at 14, the poverty, the silence she carried for years, before finding her voice. But there was something in Daniel's eyes that she recognized instantly, a loneliness so profound it had become invisible to everyone around him, a grief so constant it had become like breathing. She reached across the space between them and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin. "What do you remember most about Emma's voice?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked down at his lap where his hands had begun to tremble. "She used to sing this little song every morning, something she made up herself, completely off-key, but she was so proud of it. Sarah would record her sometimes on our old camcorder." He stopped. His throat moved. "And every night before bed, without fail, she would wrap her arms around my neck and say—" He couldn't finish. The audience was completely silent. Some people were already crying quietly. "She would say, 'Daddy, I love you bigger than the sky,'" Daniel whispered. "Every single night, for 5 years, and now I can't remember what it sounded like anymore." He finally looked up at Oprah, and she saw something she had never seen in any of her interviews before. Not sadness, not pain, something worse. Surrender. "I've tried," he continued. "For 20 years, I've tried to hear her voice in my head. I've tried to remember the exact way she said those words, but it's gone. Her voice is gone. And that feels like losing her all over again, every single day." And that's when Oprah made a decision. She turned to her producer, standing just off camera, and gave the slightest nod. The signal they had discussed backstage. The signal that would change everything. What happens next will stay with you long after you finish watching. Share this story now. "Daniel," Oprah said softly, "we have something for you." He looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "When our team was researching your story, they contacted the original investigators who worked on the fire. They went through evidence boxes that hadn't been opened in 2 decades. Most of your belongings were destroyed, completely incinerated, but they found one thing buried in the debris of what used to be your living room. It was damaged, partially melted, and everyone assumed it was beyond recovery. So they tagged it and filed it away." Daniel's face went pale. His hands stopped trembling because they had gone completely still. "What is it?" A production assistant walked onto the stage carrying a small object wrapped in soft white cloth. She handed it to Oprah with trembling hands. Her eyes were red. The entire crew knew what was about to happen. Oprah unwrapped the cloth carefully, reverently, revealing a cassette tape, warped from heat, blackened at the edges, barely recognizable as what it once was. This tape was found in what used to be your daughter's bedroom, Oprah explained, her own voice unsteady now. Our audio engineers spent 3 months working on it. They used technology that didn't exist when the fire happened. They didn't know if it would work. They warned us not to get our hopes up, she paused. But last week, they finally recovered something. Daniel stared at the tape like it was a ghost, like it was impossible. Because it was impossible. We haven't listened to it, Oprah continued. No one on my team has heard what's on this tape. We wanted you to hear it first. Whatever is on here, it belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. She gestured to the audio booth, visible through the glass partition. Whenever you're ready, Daniel. The studio fell into absolute silence. 400 people holding their breath. Cameras capturing every tremble of Daniel's lip, every flash of fear and hope in his eyes. He couldn't speak. He just nodded. The audio engineer pressed play. For a moment, there was nothing. Just static. Just the hiss and crackle of damaged magnetic tape that had survived flames and years and neglect. Daniel closed his eyes, bracing himself for disappointment. And then, a voice, small, sweet, slightly off-key, unmistakable. "Happy birthday, Daddy! I made you a song!" Daniel's eyes flew open. His hand went to his mouth. A sound escaped him that wasn't quite human. The voice continued, giggling between words. "Daddy is the bravest. Daddy is the best. Daddy fights the fires, and he never needs to rest." The audio was imperfect. It warped and wobbled. There were gaps where the heat had eaten through the tape. But it was unmistakably her. It was unmistakably Emma. The studio watched as Daniel Morrison, the man who hadn't cried in 20 years, the hero who had run into 1,000 burning buildings without flinching, began to fall completely apart. His shoulders heaved. His face crumpled like paper. A sound escaped from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a scream. It was the sound of a dam finally breaking, the sound of 20 years of frozen grief melting all at once. On the tape, Emma's voice continued, "And when I get scared at night, Daddy makes it okay. And when I grow up big and tall, I want to be like Daddy someday." A pause, a breath. Then, softer, sweeter. "Daddy, I love you bigger than the sky." The tape clicked off. The studio was frozen. Oprah sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. In 40 years, she had witnessed reunions and revelations and transformations that had moved millions. But this was different. This was watching a man meet his daughter again across the impossible distance of death. Daniel doubled over in his chair, his entire body racked with sobs. 20 years of grief poured out of him in endless waves. The audience wept openly, strangers holding hands, production staff clutching each other backstage. And Oprah did something she rarely did. She left her chair. She crossed the space between them and sat beside Daniel on the couch. She put her arm around his shoulders and held him while he cried. She didn't say anything. There were no words for this moment. There was only presence, only witness, only the sacred act of being there when someone finally allowed themselves to feel what they had been running from. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time had stopped mattering. Finally, Daniel lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen, but something fundamental had changed in them. The emptiness was gone. In its place was something Oprah recognized immediately. Life. "I thought I lost her completely," Daniel said, his voice raw and broken. "I thought the fire took everything, but she's still here. Her voice is still here." Oprah leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. "Daniel, do you understand what just happened? This is your moment. The moment you stop running and start healing." She squeezed his hand. She never left, Daniel. Love doesn't burn. It doesn't turn to ash. It finds a way to survive, even when we think it's impossible. Daniel looked at the tape. Can I hold it? She placed it gently in his palm. He clutched it to his chest like a sacred relic, like the most precious thing in the universe. I'm going to listen to this every day, he whispered. Every single day, until I see her again. The audience rose to their feet, not with thunderous applause, but with the quiet reverence of witnesses to something holy. Oprah turned to the camera. This is why we tell stories, she said softly. Not for ratings, but for moments like this. Moments when we remember that even in our darkest nights, there is still a voice calling us back to love. 6 months later, Oprah received a letter. Inside was a photograph. Daniel standing in front of a newly built children's wing at his local hospital. Above the entrance, carved in stone, the Emma Morrison Center for Burned Children. On the back, Daniel had written, "She wanted to be like me when she grew up. Now she helps me save kids every day. Thank you for giving her back to me." Oprah pinned that photograph on her office wall, because television was never about the lights or the cameras. It was about this. The voice from the fire. The love that survives the flames. The moment when a broken man finally heard his daughter say, "Good night" one more time. And somewhere, a little girl smiled, because Daddy had finally cried. And that meant he was finally ready to heal. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Some voices never die. They just wait for the right moment to remind us what matters. And when they do, they change everything. That's the legacy of that afternoon. A tape that survived the fire. And a father who finally found the courage to listen. Because sometimes the bravest thing a hero can do is not run into the flames. It's letting himself feel the heat of what he lost and choosing to keep living anyway. For Emma, for Sarah, for Michael and James, for the voice that loved him bigger than the sky.